Good afternoon, Legionaries. This is General Lance again, coming to you live. We're just here hanging out in the Bosphorus, just making a rendezvous in Constantinople, or is it Istanbul? I'm not so sure. But with me today is the People's Art of War, and I guess a little bit of the symbology here is where West meets East, and wanted to just bring you on board and welcome, Warrior.
Hello, how's it going?
I'm doing great, brother. It's really awesome to have you here, especially because I feel like, I don't know, recently, and I've been saying this for roughly the last 5 years or so, well, really since 2014 specifically, and the idea that basically the world is tilting on its axis again, right? Previously, for whatever reason, the world stopped moving. In 1991, it seemed like the end of history had come, that liberal democracy had triumphed, and as we saw, basically what happened was effectively liberal democracy triumphs, and then it collapsed at the end of the boxing match, and we're seeing new fighters come into the ring, WWE style, with we got Putin coming in, and then we got freaking apparently China with the freaking aluminum chair. But in all seriousness, though, I think that the tensions are rising, and the geopolitical flip that's happening against the United States is pretty apparent, especially to the point where it seems as though Ukraine is probably suing for terms or pursuing terms. There are significant strikes that happened by the Iranian government on Israel, and of course the ever-increasing military expansion of the PRC, and specifically their blue water capabilities and so on and so forth, in furtherance of Taiwan acquisition and so on. And I guess I just wanted your cursory, view of how things are happening, and why is it that it seems like America is on the retreat?
I would say that it has a lot to do with the vision of the current strategy. So before, the idea after 1945 was that the Americans could fulfill what Woodrow Wilson had said many years at Versailles before, in the Treaty of Versailles, which was they wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Well, Wilson was absolutely idealistic, and that didn't happen. But the idea moved on from after World War I, from okay, let's try and do this through mediation, to the UN, the idea of the UN, mediation through force. And then finally, as we started to go through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and into the GWAT, global war on terrorism, the idea that we should be the only ones to do it. It shifted from this idea of consensus to this idea of that the United States must be the only one that enforces the world order. But at the same time, the one that has to make sure that the world order conforms to to its values. There was a little bit more accommodation, I feel like, after 1945, where it was, they can see the light if only we convince them. And after 2001, it became, they must see the light. And this change from accommodation to building coalitions and advocates to being, it's my way or nothing else, has really stymied U.S. policy.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think probably the most poignant diplomat who recently retired, Victoria Nuland, is emblematic of this kind of maximalist faction, which has pursued a pretty aggressive policy since, I would say, 1995, especially in regards to the former Warsaw Pact countries, especially in Eastern Europe, in addition to, of course, throughout MENA, which is, for those of you legionaries who don't understand what MENA is the Middle East and North Africa, basically Morocco all the way down to Saudi Arabia. But the greater point that I'm trying to make, I guess, is just as you say, America, and I remember reading this from Diplomacy, the book Diplomacy by Henry Kissinger, this idea that...
book.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's fantastic. It's this idea that America sees itself as an exceptional power, right? But what is American exceptionalism to the American? Because it's funny... when you're a fish in water, you don't know what water is per se because you just feel it all the time. But when you're taken out of the water and you look at the aquarium and you see the environment in which you're swimming, you kind of understand the social strata you come from. And we Americans, I think, especially if you're kind of in this, I guess, greater sphere, maybe you are more worldly, but very few of us know what it really means to be American, and we kind of do it unconsciously. But what it really means is, for those of you, the reason why that warrior over here, People's Art of War, was referencing Wilson, it's this liberal idea of basically self-determination and the League of Nations and the triumph of liberal bourgeois culture and the enforcement of what is called, I guess... the international world order or rules-based order or whatever.
Rules-based world order, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's really a really funny way of saying America's world order, right? Whatever is the schema by which America benefits best, or rather imprints its power, cultural power, on the world in its image, right? And I think the most interesting thing to have arisen from post-1991 Desert Storm and the drawdown in military equipment, military readiness, and the focus on coin, and the inability of the DoD and the State Department to really address this new generation of warfare, or rather to move on from the antiquated form that we're used to, which is the conventional form. And why am I saying this? Because ultimately, the Putin regime, obviously the PRC and Iran, and a number of our different adversaries, both non-state and state actors, are probably the most masterful operators in regards to leveraging like the human dynamic. I guess I wanted to ask you, why is it that America is so stuck in this rut as far as not being able to... inspire loyalty back home? Why is it that we can't, leverage the same kind of warfare that they are doing so effectively against us?
So there's really two reasons. One, America hasn't explained to itself why it needs these wars. Two, our enemy, the United States enemies, understand them more than the United States understands their enemies. It goes back to like Sun Tzu's Art of War, where you have to know yourself and you have to know your enemy. But in this case, the U.S. government policy does not know itself and it does not know its enemy. So what I mean by not know itself, let's break that down a bit. It's really, if you look at that time period when you say that made the world safe from democracy, from the Versailles. So I always start with Versailles because this is what altered World War II, what altered the post-war World War II world order. If you look at how they discussed the League of Nations, and Wilson did it, he went to the American public. Then that's a key. He went to the American public and explained it. Now, and Congress and the American public didn't want to deal with it, but Wilson made the effort to explain it, to educate, and to explain how it tied to American values. Now, when he did that, he was also explaining to values that were already known, like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the classical American values that have been enshrined since the Constitution and have been debated endlessly. Now, that was known to Americans because the education system educated it. When I say before that Americans don't know what they stand for, it's after you run into this case where throughout the Cold War and before World War II, they understood what they stood for. So policymakers could appeal to that. After 1991, that changed. You saw a world order where it was, you should already know what you stand for. There was no attempt to educate on what that world, what America actually stood for, or what America stood for in the post-war era, in the post-Cold War era. It was just assumed that it was the end of history, and therefore you didn't need to understand that. So by the time 2001 rolled around, people were starting to express sentiments that, well, they are against our way of life. It's not, if you look and compare that versus, let's say, World War II, communism, the Cold War, World War I, it was before they're against our way of life, our way of life, and this is why. After 2001, it was, they were just against our way of life, which could mean anything. And that right there, you could see the beginning of the bankruptcy of the system. There was no values. There was no sense of why they're fighting. And it was just, we defend our way of life, but we don't know what our way of life is. And by that point, the education on what it meant to be an American wasn't well known, nor the values, nor how a standard on how those values are. So that's the first part. The second part was, they don't know the enemy. So in the Cold War, you would see often exchanges between the USSR and the United States. I mean, like full on exchanges. You take students from the United States, they go to Russia, they learn about the USSR. Russia sends people to the United States, and they learn about the US. I mean, this was a byproduct of the USSR and the United States trying to mitigate the peace a little bit so that they could have a little bit of understanding. And you saw this quite a bit with China too. We saw this in the 80s and the 90s with the foreign students coming back and forth and people going to Chinese think tanks and US think tanks. Well, the downside is that the US after 91 didn't want to do that anymore. The idea was as well, 1991 is the year they declared ultimate victory. The United States has won, and therefore we don't need to understand ourselves and we don't need to understand the people. This is the end of history, like Francis Fukuyama said, and we don't need to understand where it goes because it's our history. And because of that, you have this instance where people don't know what they stand for, so they can't create good foreign policy. They can't articulate it. Right. You have this instance where they don't know what the enemy is or who their enemies are. And because they don't understand them, they don't understand the historical background of these people, their interests, or why they're acting the way they are. So
before you continue, I'm sorry if I interject here, but first of all, Francis Fukuyama, you hear me? History never ends, Francis. I'm coming for you. No, I'm just kidding. But in all the seriousness, though, is, it seems to me that it's like we kind of just dropped pack, culturally speaking. But I think the most important thing is that with that, it sounds like you have to know yourself in order to be able to give yourself context or at least a bearing on the position of what the enemy stands for, right? I mean, it's pretty like spatial kind of reasoning when it comes to, of course, strategy, but it seems like there's this nebulous, almost dross. I don't even know how you would describe it, but this cultural tiredness, this general malaise, self-doubting, self-critic kind of wave that happened. And I wanted to ask you, a lot of this has to do with the Gramsciite basically tactic of changing the culture to basically Marxify it. And I think they've been extremely successful. And it's part of the reason why so much of critical history is built on destroying what American values are, and then of course not replacing it with anything meaningful at all. And I wanted to ask you, like, what is up with that? Is that a legacy of the Cold War? Is that the establishment? Or is our regime basically Trotskyites? What's the deal with that?
I would say it is the legacy of the Cold War. So before 1991, it was pretty clear who the United States enemy was. It was Russia, the communists, that sort of thing. And to fight that, these leaders who had lived through World War II had to define the values and why they were fighting it. After 1991, people had been on edge since 1945 for so long, they just let it go. By the time 2001 came around, it ended up being, okay, so, we need to think about these values that we have. And it ended up being, they didn't know what they wanted to do. So what's easier than to create? It's hard to create a philosophy or an ideology that adapts to a new world, that takes actual political scientists. So in your case, what you're talking about, what happened is they said, well, it's easier to criticize. Let's just criticize the system. And by criticizing the system without understanding what parts they could take that were still useful and parts to throw out for the 21st century, they picked it apart into nothing. So at this point, there is really nobody in government, I would say, who fully understands what they're doing or what exactly the political values or the national values are. They picked it apart to the point that there's none. And it seems like it's a lot, but the answer is pretty simple. They couldn't find the effort to redefine what the country stood for the 21st century. So it was easier just to pick apart what it stood for before in order to win points.
The most interesting thing to me is that many people, I mean, especially if you were raised in the United States, you're kind of, I don't know, cram-fed all this World War II propaganda, and a lot of our cultural horizon is defined by the incidents that were part of that event. But this is something that happened like 80 years ago, and all the ideologies which were present then have been long dead, right? I mean, fascism is dead. Really, Marxist-Leninism is dead. Obviously, liberalism as it was construed under Wilson is certainly dead. And I think what's happened, and the most interesting thing that you see, and you talk about this from political science perspective, and I can understand why you give such credence and importance to a philosophy for a country, and I give it that same kind of value as well. But I think most people don't understand why. Why is it so important to have a cogent self-understanding, a cogent what's called a narrative here, but the most important thing, or more important than simply a narrative, but a spirituality that's basically shared and will harmonize society and bring it together along one axiom, which is basically how we all define our lives, even though, of course, it's kind of like medieval society. We could all understand that the basically medieval society in Europe, for instance, was revolved around the church and that kind of spirituality, and everything kind of spun out from there. That was the axiom, right? Well, what happened with the end of the Cold War is that the axiom upon which the United States built itself on has been completely eaten away. But the same thing has happened also to the PRC, to the Russian Federation, and to the various state actors of the world. And I think the most interesting thing that's coming out of Russia and probably the PRC is probably this new organic vision of itself. And I think I remember one of the most shocking or weird conceptions, which was, or rather statements by Xi, was the idea that, I think it was and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm paraphrasing, but it was a cultural revolution was a leftist mistake. Do you remember this quotation at the Communist Party's annual address, I think?
No, I haven't been paying attention to that specifically.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, roughly speaking, it was kind of a moment in which Xi was critiquing part of Mao's program, which is, I mean, I'm sure you can probably elucidate for us, but, you don't simply do that, especially because Mao is central to modern China's ethos, right? And the reason why I bring it up is because you and I both see that the Soviet Union was gone one day and the Russian Federation was up the next. That's a pretty, black and white circumstance to see, and it's likely to have a different kind of political philosophy, which is yet to be defined. I think it's really just kind of like illiberal democracy, or whatever you may call it. But the interesting thing about the PRC is that it's evolved beyond its Maoist, Marxist-Leninist kind of paradigm into something quite else, and I kind of wanted you just to talk about that. What is it that China is trying to accomplish? What's your view on those things?
It's to reverse the century of humiliation. So we had 150 years after the end of the Opium War, where the European powers imperialized, they took our land, they cut very, very lucrative contracts for themselves because we were weak. And China is full of resources. But if we look at how China's doing now, it's to attempt to reverse, it's not attempt, but it is to reverse that. We've seen huge changes since the 1980s, ever since Deng Xiaoping took power. And much of that has to do with trying to, it's still a national focus. The one thing that a lot of people make a mistake, especially with communism in China or Vietnam, is that they think it's Russian style communism or it's an Eastern European style communism. That could be the farthest from the truth. In the Vietnamese or the East Asian communism thinking, the nation is put first. It's said, well, we need to figure out our national character and then adapt Marxist-Leninism to it. With the Eastern European and the Russian, it was, well, let's figure out how we can make ourselves more Marxist-Leninist to the point that we can spread it to elsewhere, or we can make it more Marxist-Leninist without involving ethnic groups into it. See, and so that's a big difference.
One is universalist, and the other is exceptionalist in the sense that, when China became Marxist, it was Chinese first, and then had Marxist characteristics, whereas the Soviets were fundamentally aspiring to have an internationalist state. Am I wrong or correct?
That is essentially the essence of it. I mean, there is differences if you look at Yugoslavia or you look at Russia or look at the USSR. There's differences, but yes, they were trying to enforce the idea of universalism at the expense of the minorities, that the ethnic minorities that existed in these states, versus the nation first and then the ethnic minorities, because Vietnam and China have ethnic minorities. But the idea is there's just, if you asked a Chinese Korean, like a Korean who lives in the Northeast, they were going to say, yes, I'm Korean, but I'm also Chinese. And that response stumps a lot of Westerners. They're like, how can you do that? They're like, well, no, my identity is unique, and it's allowed to exist. But I exist within the nation, which is China. So I speak Chinese, I speak Korean, but I'm Chinese citizen. Mm-hmm. It's the nation. The nation is put first. With the Yugoslavians, for example, there was Tito did quite a bit of suppression of some of the ethnic groups. He would suppress the ethnic identities because we're Yugoslavian. And if he started trying to push up some of the other ethnic identities, Tito would crack down. It wasn't like, well, we honor your identity and therefore you're part of us. Let's see how we can get along. It was, no, you're Yugoslavian. And the USSR was less like that. They still said, okay, well, you have Kazakh SSR, you have Ukrainian SSR, you have the Baltic SSR. But if you were too ethnically nationalist and you showed too much, then it was, okay, no, you're not allowed to do this. Whereas with the China and the Vietnamese style communism, with the exception, I would say, of that Pol Pot in Cambodia, the idea was, okay, well, you're a part of us. You're allowed to express your ethnic group, but at the same time, you have to do it within our framework.
Yeah, I think that's the most interesting thing. And, a lot of people have a lot of disparaging remarks about the East Asian, basically communist bloc, what's called the communist bloc. But the most interesting thing, for instance, the Viet Minh, who fought against the French, were primarily nationalists. And of course, you have alternatives to Ho Chi Minh at the time during the 40s and 50s. But I think you're absolutely correct. And, the most interesting thing is that as time goes on, we're going to start seeing that a porous country or state, basically information-wise, travel-wise, trade-wise, is ultimately injurious to the cohesion of the wider polity. And I think the most interesting thing, and it's probably why the PRC is such a powerhouse and why it's so, pretty much indomitable, is because of the fact that it closes itself off from what the West does in Russia, which is regularly incites kind of popular demonstrations and all of the NGO stuff and all that kind of stuff. And the most interesting thing is that the way that the Chinese are today is how we were in the 1920s, where when we had immigrants that would come, they would assimilate. They'd become anglicized, and they would be very strongly culturally pressured to basically, civilize themselves to become American. Whereas now, it's a very strange circumstance where it feels like somehow the American ethnicity, core ethnicity, is kind of like the subjugated class to basically kind of, I guess, serve the rest of the world, and that everyone else is not even a guest. It's like they're the master. And I guess there's this term which I love, and the liberals hates, Baizuo. Can you explain that term for me a little bit?
It means white left.
And like, what the implication? How is it perceived exactly? Like, I guess why I'm saying this is because I want the legionaries out there to understand from an outside perspective what it's like to deal with these people.
So it refers to it refers to Western liberals and leftists. So specifically on our social media, it's used to refer to these really naive, idiotic people who according to our social media, who support Western causes without kind of thinking. They just see, oh, well, it works over there, so maybe we can support it here. So it's a very common complaint on Chinese social media. So you'll see it with a lot of the pro-China accounts complain about this. Good example is the white paper thing that happened during zero COVID. Another one is the Hong Kong movement. So it's not so much as they blindly support Western liberalism and that sort of thing. It's they blindly support it and they actively court it. And actively courted here is the main point. So we do have people who are Chinese communists who are saying, well, we need to be liberalized a little bit. Those people do exist. But these people would be what you call an actual fifth column. They say, well, no, we need to be like the United States. And a good example of a Baizuo to Chinese is the Hong Kong protesters. They were flying United States flags. Now, if someone was protesting China, if someone was protesting the United States and they started flying Chinese flags, I get why an American would get offended. Or if you were in Brazil and you were flying, I don't know, American flags and saying Brazil should be America, of course you'd be offended. Of course. It's natural. Yeah. And it'd be natural. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, that's the difference. What these people are, they're not liberalism. They're not saying, "Hey, let's try." They're not saying, "Let's go easy. Why don't you go back on the restrictions?" Or they're not saying, "Let's open up more foreign businesses and allow more foreigners in." That I can get that. That's reasonable. These people are actively trying to subvert the government because they want to replace it.
They're seditionists. Yes, right?
They want to replace the current government with one of their own making. It's not to be able to make things better for the people. It's to change the hierarchy so that they're on top and they can force their ideology.
Oh, that's nice. It's all about them. I've heard this a lot, especially here in America. We know a lot of our statesmen do exactly the same thing, which is basically, sell out our country. They would sell their daughter to OnlyFans. They sell out our country for, pennies. And, as you can see, Americans kind of get sold out. But it's funny that you mentioned what you're talking about, because if I remember correctly, Xi has been pretty deft when it comes to handling these seditious elements within the PRC framework. And what I mean is, I think it was roughly 4 years ago, or 5 years ago now, 2019, that Xi kind of went to clamp down on a set of oligarchs, kind of rivals that were very friendly to the West. Is this the element that you're talking about?
It's a lot deeper than that. It's more along the lines of he's trying to consolidate central control. So it's trying to centralize the government. One of the bigger issues that we had during the 90s and the 00s was an outpouring of corruption. So corrupt officials, not as bad as the 80s, but corrupt officials benefiting from deals with foreign countries, corrupt officials selling information, corporations getting out of control. Much of that tamp down that you're seeing is to be able to control a lot of that corruption, or at the very least trying to centralize power in one authority. The power structure for the PRC has changed quite a bit too since the 2000s. And it's usually before, you could only run for 2 terms and then you step down and had someone else. in the current case, he's not doing that. There's a definite like third term he's taking for there. And that's a little different. And that signals that right now there's a huge focus on the centralization. Not to mention there is more of use of cultural revolutionary language to support what's going on. So it's kind of trying to keep outsiders out, the corporations from getting Western corporations or outside corporations from getting too much power, which is understandable, but it's also a consolidation of power.
It's interesting. And I mean, how do the, I guess, citizens of the PRC view, I mean, do they view Xi as an autocrat? Do they see autocracy as a bad thing? I mean, because it's probably such a foreign world. I mean, I've never been to China, and I don't know what it's like. And frankly, I don't have much exposure to, well, I have some exposure to Cantonese, but not to the Han Chinese. And I guess I just wanted to, like, give us some kind of perceptions of things, because in the United States, like, if we don't see elections or turnovers or whatever, it's kind of like a big deal. What's the perception of that?
The pro-Chinese would roast me for this, but not everybody is happy with what's going on. I'll put it that way. Not everyone is happy with what's going on. And to be fair here, global economic problems are on both sides, not just the United States, but also China. Despite all the triumphalism, there is some economic problems that are going on, especially around the financial system on both sides. The United States and China were very dependent on each other more than people understand. And a lot of the reason the United States could survive 2008 was because China bought out a lot of the U.S. debt, but the United States also bought a whole bunch of goods from China. So it's not this one-sided thing. What you're seeing, how people are really perceiving it is they're not really exactly happy about what's going on. But at the same time, they're still loyal to the country. So there's still this hope that, yes, things will get better in the future. But at the same time, if you're reading not the over-triumphalist takes, there's this sort of reluctance. And they're not happy with 100% what's going on, especially the youth unemployment, the housing market's not doing too well. And then on top of that, there's also the increased amounts of bureaucracy that's happened ever since 2020, and bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy.
Wow. I mean, it's pretty crazy to me, because it feels like it really is shut off. I mean, from the West, you can't just go into Chinese internet or anything and engage with them, and so it's like it's very rare to meet someone that kind of just talks about inside scoops and what it's like.
It's not so much that they're shut off from the West. If you wanted to go on Weibo and like look at the social media or Xiaohongshu, you can look at them. They're not hard to look at. The main problem is the language barrier, and the language barrier is probably the biggest problem that you're going to face, because it's East Asian. I can speak Chinese and Japanese. East Asian languages, whether it's Chinese, Japanese, Korean, even Vietnamese, it's high context. Western languages like English are considered low context. So originally in English, if you say what you're saying, it literally means that. With East Asian languages, we can hint. So there's more information contained in that. And that changes a lot of how stuff gets translated from Chinese to English and from English to Chinese. There's a lot more, I would say, information and context depth. So a lot of we assume that you know the context. And if you look at the Chinese social media, it's a lot different than the US. It's a lot different than the Western ones. And the language barrier and the contextual issue plays a huge role.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's because I think here in the United States, especially people that have any exposure to DoD think tanks and so on and so forth, of course they beat the battle drum when it comes to Russia, because Russia is a safe target. Russia is this kind of cultural hangover. Even though the boomers don't understand that the Soviet Union is a communist state and not a Russian state, they'll still be adamant it's the same thing. But whatever, there's still a geopolitical case to be made. I'm just trying to say that basically it's very easy, right? And their levers of cultural control and lobbying and relative economic power is very weak. But when it comes to the PRC, of course, we can't say anything because at the end of the day, like they have placed themselves very well in the United States, and obviously through a number of different avenues, which are, of course, part of unrestricted warfare and all that kind of stuff. But there's this growing, it's not even leeriness, but it's a fear of the PRC and its ambitions abroad. And I guess one thing I kind of, I understand this fear because it is kind of, I mean, for instance, there's this guy called, General Spalding. He's an Air Force retired general that wrote this book called Stealth War. Have you read it?
No, but I know a bit about Spalding.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, he's the one that kind of, I guess, maybe broached the subject in a one-book format for mass consumption, but obviously he cites unrestricted warfare and all that stuff, and that's the chatter going on in the war colleges in the United States. And it seems like, of course, they don't talk about it too openly in the zeitgeist because I think there's a serious fear, right? There's a serious fear of the PRC. But like, here's what I think, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the PRC or historically the Han Chinese have an interest in imperial expansion the way that the Europeans do. I think, and my perception, and of course you can correct me if I'm wrong, is more about necessarily spreading influence and trade and not necessarily territorial expansion. Can you explain to me a little bit like what that kind of Han perception of the world is?
Yes, we still go by a very, I wouldn't say insular, but we like to stay in our own area outside of trade or defending the initial trade routes. So if you look at Belt and Road, a lot of the people like Spalding or the Blob think that, oh, this must be similar to the British Empire. China is going to establish some sort of massive colonial empire going from Tel Aviv to Kashgar. But that's not really the case. It's more to supply and like keep the trade lines and the resources coming in.
Well,
I mean, if you look,
conscience impugns,
right? It's projection, and that goes on to what I was going to say. They're projecting onto China things that they don't understand, and that's mostly because they don't understand the history. There's no understanding of the history, and therefore no understanding of the motivation and no understanding of the culture. History, culture, and geography all define like what a country is going to do for centuries. I mean, geography and culture is destiny. I'm going to put that straight. The downside, though, is with the war colleges, and I've consistently seen this when I was still in the military, is there's just this big question mark when it comes to China. But they can't afford to look like they're dumb. They can't say, I don't know, or they can't say, I need to research this. With Russia, there is enough. With Russia and the USSR, when the Cold War was happening, there was enough info. So, I mean, we can talk endlessly about how many Germans were in Russia or Volga Germans or how many people there. So there was kind of a back and forth exchange. With China, it's relatively a big question mark because the relationship with China and the West has been for the last 100 years. Well, how do we define ourselves in relation to the West? And how do we balance power because they are trying to exploit us? So there's a big question mark. And the power balance was always on the other side where they didn't really have to think about China. China was just someone they used to fight Japan. China was just someone who was just a nation that, they closed up. Oh, China's a place we can do factories. And if you look at the current assumptions, they all fall into those three things. Now, if you read like Kissinger's on China, the man's a genius. Like he goes into the culture, he goes into history, and he really explores like what the thinking is. And to go back to what you were saying before, it is very much about balance of power. The idea of China, when you see like the incursions into the South China Sea, if you see the Belt Road, it's to maintain those trade links between other nations. It's not so much as you're not likely going to see a Chinese invasion of Indonesia. That's not going to happen. You might see a Chinese base or a PRC or a PLAN carrier force docking there, but you will not see a actual invasion. So that's the difference. If you want to think about it between the West and China, the West is more, well, we're going to actually set up colonies. We're going to put colonial administrators, and then we're going to puppet you. But we're going to
people. Yeah, it's different.
We're going to physically be there.
Yep.
Yeah, and it goes from, like, if you look at America's Manifest Destiny or how the British did it, yeah, that's very the case. But if you look at Chinese history and you go back as far, like we subjugated the Vietnamese. Let's be honest here, and we did that for the Koreans too. But it was never okay, we're going to turn you into Chinese. It was, do you pay us tribute? We're going to put some troops there, but are you going to pay us tribute? Are you going to keep up the trade? Okay, great. Then if you're paying us, then what do we care? And if you look also at like how like Ming Dynasty and these other places did it, their military expeditions, it's to, hey, you need to know that we're your main trading partner. There is a form, of course, every culture has its own form of hegemony. But the hegemony, the way Chinese go about it culturally, is different.
Yeah, I think, and I want to give you, the legionaries who are listening, some context here, because I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm going to slob on freaking Xi's knob or anything, Like, I think that obviously at the end of the day I'm an American patriot, but I think the reason why I'm broaching the subject is because I think there's this misperception. And it stems from, as I say, a guilty conscience. And as you can see from the Ukraine, and roughly the post-Cold War agreement was roughly that, we spoke to Boris Yeltsin and that we agreed we wouldn't expand our influence, our sphere of influence, east. And every year we have been, we basically lied and, pushed them all the way to the hilt. And I think, this is not a bad thing per se. This is called power maximization. This is just an objective truth, right? And this is a strategy. And the strategy behind that is, of course, the United States wants to be the unipolar hegemon, world hegemon. Part of our basically geopolitical strategy is to ensure, first of all, the free trade navigation, the export of democracy, and whatever, the liberal democracy. I hate that ideology. But anyway, but also most importantly is to make no one else powerful enough to effectively check us. And the reason why the Americans are, especially the DoD, is so worried about the Belt and Road Initiative and the String of Pearls and the R&D base in Argentina and so on and so forth is because what the PRC is doing is affording itself different avenues to outmaneuver the United States from, let's say, an embargo, which is the favored diplomatic/military strategic weapon used to shut in a country, either to make them relent or to do them, to subjugate them, so on and so forth. And a good example of this is, of course, Switzerland, right? Bank Suisse and a number of different creditors have been basically banking like gnomes in the mountains for, I think, almost a millennia now. And the way that they went about it was that their secrecy of their account holders was getting in the way of American counter-terrorist, basically efforts, right? And how we actually ended up getting into the personal information as America in Swiss bank accounts is by effectively threatening them to be shut out of all global markets. That means food, fuel, everything. And so, there's this thing called Stripe, or it's not Stripe. What's the
Swift?
Swift.
Swift.
And Swift is basically this ability for banks to internationally transfer cash, specifically USD, across, instantaneously. If you get off that, it really messes you up. It's infrastructure stuff. So what the PRC is doing right now is effectively building themselves a strong foundation to make themselves at least, if not immune, robust enough in the face of any kind of pressure, so that way they're not a junior partner, so they're not subjugated. Now, like, I'm not putting a moral patina on that, right? The history of the world is a history of combat. But I think people really don't underestimate, especially in the DoD Beltway circle, they think that the Chinese are going to invade the world. Oh my God, you know what I mean? No, that's not how it works.
And it's nothing like that. It's nothing like that, because what we see since 1991 is a unipolar world. Unipolar world for the majority of human civilization is extremely rare. It's almost rare to the point of being an exception. And many of these in the Beltway are banging on the idea that this is the norm going into the future. But if you look at even when Britain was a great imperial power, or even France, there was a multipolar world order. I mean, France existed alongside Britain, and then the United States rose. And then if you even go farther back, it's the same thing with different players. So what we're seeing right now with this unipolar, and with China or even Russia trying to develop their own counter systems, is the norm. It's not the exception. What we've seen the last 20 years is the exception since 1991. 30 years, excuse me.
Yeah, it's. I mean, who can blame them really? I mean, I'm not partial to these. Trotsky. I don't even know what they are, dude, because they're definitely not American. At the end of the day, I can understand from, their boots that they want power, right? And once you've got that taste for universal empire, you don't want to give it up. But I think there's this alarmism, which I'm very scared of, because at the end of the day, we're in an atomic age, and the PRC is an atomically equipped superpower, and it's not a joke. It's a country with 1.3 billion people. I don't know. Beyond that, it's not just that it's just one big biomass either. The way that the West paints the Chinese as this kind of like bugman horde, like something out of Starship Troopers, is just false. I mean, at the end of the day, very competent and determined enemy at the end if they want to be. But it's like, I mean, what does America really stand to gain from keeping Taiwan, really? And I don't know. Like, I'm not here to be a defeatist or anything or whatever, but like, it just drives me crazy because we see that the DoD and the military are in shambles as far as recruiting numbers, combat readiness. There's no serious industrial base to back up an industrial scale war. We can't even keep up a partial campaign in the Ukraine, let alone one against a formidable enemy with a substantial industrial base, with a motivated populace, and one that obviously has a reason to fight and to fight strongly. Of course, like, to be humiliated, that is that feeling of revenge is stronger than whatever Americans, whatever crap we're on. I mean, we're like on this guilt trip. It's pathetic. And so it's just like, at the end of the day, like, I don't know. My personal opinion is just kind of like, why the fuck that happened. But I guess moving on, I wanted to ask you about this, but my perception of the PRC, knowing nothing about Chinese or Chinese culture or anything like that, was that the PRC was offering an alternative model of basically governance and political harmony and basically national harmony, right? And the way I see it is that the United States has overextended itself, not merely in a political sense, but it has made itself porous, which means the frontier is like infinitely wide. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the Roman Empire,
reference.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Roman reference.
Yeah. Well, if you think of the Roman Empire, you're like, you think of the frontier, and the frontier's way out there. But now in the internet age, if you have no firewalls, what ends up happening is basically every square inch of the West is the frontier. Every pocket, every cell phone, every computer, every lobbying party, every airplane, every this and that and the other thing, everything is connected, especially when a lot of your hardware, especially your communications hardware, comes from the PRC. And so the interesting thing is that I don't know how effective this is, and I wanted to ask you about, but like the PRC has this thing called the Great Firewall or whatever. Is that effective? How effective is it? How effective is the PRC in basically countering foreign influencing campaigns and so on and so forth?
I mean, you're never going to totally stop people from getting around the firewall with the VPN. If you try to stop people too much, then it's going to waste your resources. The main goal of the Great Firewall is to slow it down, sort of like handcuffs. It's not just there to limit out the foreign influences, but it's also there to limit their ability to do work inside China, like whether it's intelligence agencies or this other stuff. I mean, that's a little different with business, but we'll talk about that later. The firewall isn't exactly what people say it is. I mean, obviously you cannot go to like certain websites. That's pretty obvious, but like certain other stuff, like if you used a VPN, you can get around it. So people said, then why are you using a firewall if you can use a VPN? The point isn't to stop people from doing that. If we ban all drugs tomorrow, are you going to stop everyone from taking drugs? No, but you are going to significantly reduce it. I mean, you're going to lengthen the time that it takes people to obtain it, to do illegal things. And the point of the firewall is that it's to be able to, one, prevent all these outside influences from coming in and affecting people. It's a form of censorship. Let's be honest here. But the idea in the United States,
here's the thing is that
censorship is not a bad thing. Yeah. Censorship is not a bad thing. Yeah. And the United States has used censorship in the past.
I mean, we do it right now. I mean, they do it all the time, and they just do it like in a circuitous way, right? They launder it through, of course, pressuring various private enterprise. But why do I say that's not bad? Because ultimately, I mean, there has to be a cone of acceptable discourse, and what I mean by that is that, like, for instance, Baizuo, their like ideology, their culture, it's poison and it's killing us because it's like a psychological weapon. That's what it is. And so it's ridiculous with them too, because they've adopted a lot of the terrible habits the West did. Like, and I'm talking like Reddit stuff, cucking, that sort of thing, and it's insane. No, and this is what's coming up through a VPN. I mean, like
Americans,
white liberals, like the whole actual liberal, like it's like brain AIDS. I really don't get it. You know what I mean? I don't know what it is that necessarily makes people absolutely warp their brains to the point where, like, I don't know what kind of ideology it is. I don't know where they get it from. Maybe it's just because they were born that way and they're the descendants of basically, like, I don't know, like low tier individuals or something. But the thing is that, like, ultimately you just can't have that. Like, it's undermining all of civilization.
I'm going to shock you.
Go ahead.
I'm going to shock you. It's not so much as they don't know what they're doing. It's they don't know what they're doing, and when they do stuff that's absolutely destabilizing to society, no one punishes them. So there's two ways society punishes people: through laws, which of course you go to jail or you get a fine or something like that, and through shame. And Confucius even said this a long time ago: he who is not ashamed is not human. There's a reason why shame exists. And when a society runs out of shame, it can't enforce certain norms. And these people that you're seeing go on these ends is because they fundamentally have no shame. And shame has to be educated. It has to be taught through consequences, and it has to be emphasized from the beginning. And they don't have it. And that's why you see a lot of this outrageous behavior in politics and in society.
Yeah, I mean, these people have no fear either, and it's
none.
This is the weakness of liberalism, and I mean, people always say or claim that the West is defined by its libertinism, its liberty. That's just absolute horse crap. I mean, it wasn't the case before 1776, 1789. This is a complete farce, and to say nothing, of course, that when those quote-unquote liberal revolutions happened, they were still today extremely repressive. I mean, in the United States, for instance, the early revolutionary or post-revolutionary America, there were serious blasphemy laws. You would be hanged for doing certain things that we thought would be innocuous. But the wider point that I'm trying to make here is that the world needs to move on from the liberal ideology because it legitimates things which are injurious to civilization as a whole, to the individual as well. It's injurious to, like, a human excellence in general, and it's basically freaking AIDS, but on a civilizational level. And of course, in the West, we have no shame culture for a very long time. It's a guilt culture thing, and unfortunately, we have Christianity to blame from that. We got a couple things going on, but point being is, the interesting thing that I thought, or at least I perceived the PRC to do, is provided an alternate model for what the future could hold. Because for me, if you actually want civilizational pluralism, that is to say, actual, genuine, true, nations that are different from each other, that means that you also need to halt the spread of information, right? So that way one doesn't contaminate the rest. And I don't know if you remember this, but 20 years ago, Europe was a little bit more Europe than it is today. Today, it's just like going to the United States Part 2. And my greatest fear, like, for instance, when I travel to Brazil, is this America mania, which is basically, I don't know what it is, but it just becomes part 2 of America. But
soft power.
Exactly. And the only way to guard against
power
that is holding up a certain amount of, internal passports, keeping populations and businesses and information from getting in and out. So that way you actually cultivate a genuine and unpolluted culture. What's your opinion?
And that brings up another point. Japanese and Koreans have been complaining about this too. So every culture has loanwords. There's a lot of loanwords in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese from English. Now, if you look at how they're addressed, it's different. Japanese will literally take the word and then put it into katakana and then just to say it. Okay. But that's led to an increase in the amount of loanwords. Same with Korean. And there's movements in both countries where they say, no, we need to reduce the amount of loanwords. We need to turn some of these words that are Japanese in American, like refrigerator, in Japanese is reizoko. It's a pure Japanese word, but they need to be able to do it into terms that preserve the culture. And people don't realize this, but a lot of that loanwords or this inclusion of like English into daily language is a sign of, one, the culture is slipping, and two, it's a sign of what people would call overly cultural influence to like what you mentioned with Brazil, to the point that the language is lost. And when the language is lost, the culture loses a lot of its dynamicism. And you can see that in places like the Philippines. I mean, every other word that they throw out is just English, and it's not to communicate, it's to show status. And in the process, the language gets down. And this is a major issue that's going on in Asia, whether people like it or not. And governments are debating that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem worldwide, and I think the issue is that most people don't see it as a problem because they don't understand the implication. Because it's beyond simple pride or, instinct or whatever. And I'll get a little bit into the details because I want to actually buttress my argument as to why it is a threat. Well, here's the thing. At the end of the day, culture comes from a certain biology and shared national consciousness, class consciousness, as well as individual consciousness, right? I mean, we have family memories and so on and so forth. And on top of everything else, like the collective consciousness of a civilization is something that you cultivate over time. And why is that important? Well, of course, it's about deepening the understanding from your perspective of the universe, and then leading to unique ends which allow human bifurcation down the line, right? So this is why, for instance, it's a problem when there's invasive species that mingle or basically cause a homogeneous, basically speciation, a lack of speciation, because what ends up happening is if one fails, it's done, right? And the greater problem that I see is that on top of everything else, American culture, this pigeon culture, is something akin to late imperial Rome, where it basically annihilates the local nation and makes them this bastard people who don't know themselves. And when you don't have that self-confidence, you don't have, as we were talking about earlier, that central narrative of who you are. That's what culture confers to you. It's a self-understanding brought to you by ancestors in a shared collective consciousness. And when you lack that, you lack your true self. You lack a soul. You lack a collective national soul, and by default, you also lack an individual one that has context and meaning by default. And so it's a civilizational threat. And I guess what I'm trying to say, and maybe you can give you some feedback, but what I enjoyed, or I think is important about the PRC, is that they have this almost, they call them, hermits, but I think it's actually a good thing, because the reason why there are like 5,000 different nations in Europe is because we did the same thing in the medieval times and then previous for a long time. And so what ends up happening is you incubate unique cultures instead of having this biomass of semi-Americanized, whatever it may be today. Oh, what are your thoughts?
It goes down to centralization of culture and assimilation. So if you look at the United States before the 20th century, in the 20th century and the 19th, there was this idea of, we've defined our central idea of our values, and we've defined our central thing. There is a debate about the values, but there isn't really a debate about what they are. And that's what the freedom of speech idea was supposed to be. You're supposed to be able to debate what those values mean and how you interpret it, because those values form a structure, and you have to think about that. And you have to interpret that for the age, which is what it did. But what's happening now is you see this in the United States, where it's just, I can interpret it however I want. So it becomes a mismatch. And the one thing we did right before, I would say in the 80s and 90s with China, was we said, okay, these are our values. There's a national goal that we're going to do this. We are going to emphasize this in school. We're going to emphasize this as you grow up. It's not brainwashing so much as saying, hey, people, this is what we need to focus on. This is where we need to go. This is how you think about it, how you interpret it's up to you. But this is the foundation. You're right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Exactly. The foundation. This is the foundation. This is the national direction we do. If the government wants to step in to balance it, we will, because we had horrible corruption back in the 80s and the 90s. And that's where the government steps in. But at the same time, you have to define the foundation. And what happens with the United States too much is the government steps in too much to try and play fair. But the people don't know, but everyone's interpreting something a different way, when it really should be, let's focus on what does it mean to be an American in the 21st century. Okay, I'm not the most pro-American person, but any nation, whether it's Russia, China, United States, has to figure that out. What is in this current time period, what does it mean to be X? Mm-hmm. And that's the most important part.
I wanted to, if you could tease us a little bit more, some of your thoughts, because I think that's the challenge of today, and maybe you feel it like this, but I feel like there's this great cultural malaise, a lack of purpose, especially in the West. This kind of, it's like a geriatric, and a lack of balls in men, and a lack of women in women, and a lack of future. And I think the question of the time, more than anything, is a spiritual, cultural assertion, new syntheses. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it goes down to a breakdown of the structures that sustain transmission and creation and preservation of a culture across generations. Now, if you look at whether it's like Chinese culture, American culture, any culture, what makes it last longer? It's about trying to be able to convey that, and then the next generation trying to build on that. But if you look at the Western culture right now, it's lacking that. There's a deep collapse of intellectual life. So the very learning of the culture erodes. So you get to this point where human experience narrows, and then people don't want to understand the world. And we see this on the Twitter timeline all the time. People indulging these very weird, superstitious peasant beliefs about everything from medicine to people to ethnic groups. And that's the thing. If you want to be able to do that, you have to not just be able to know what the culture stands for, you have to be able to define the ideology, and you have to educate it and be able to define a language that be able to explain it. And that's a large reason of what's going on. There's a huge gap between what the values are, what the philosophy of what that values are, and then why it's needed. And the why is the big part. People do not know what the why, so they don't form a value and they do not form an ideology, and at the same time do not form a path forward. And that's a large reason why we're seeing a lot of these declines across the board.
It's interesting. I mean, it seems like, I think there's a lot of, maybe it's rising, maybe it's gestating, maybe it's like way below the surface, but like a volcano, it will erupt at some point. But there's just this massive layer of cusp. But anyway, I won't go further down this rabbit hole. Maybe in the future we'll come back to it. But I wanted just some parting thoughts as far as for the young warriors out there listening. To get a better understanding of the PRC, because obviously I reference to them, information that's adversarial, right? I tell them to read Unrestricted Warfare. I tell them to read, Stealth War and a number of different things, which are important. But I think would you recommend any English language, material that we could better understand the PRC or the Chinese, at base, at center, at core, to understand each other?
Oh, the two ones that you really need to learn is Ezra Vogel's Deng. Deng Xiaoping. Yeah, that's the one. You have to really read that. It's very, very good. It gives you a good idea into how he thinks, how China's been thinking. The other one is On China by Kissinger. Those two by far are the most important if you want to understand what's going on and why the PRC is moving in the direction it is. These ones are really good because they really dig into the mindset of it. Oh, another one, Red Star Rising. These are all written by American authors. Red Star Rising is, Edward Snow? Red Star Over China. It's from 1937 by Edward Snow. It's an account of the Communist Party and when Mao Zedong was rising before he took power. These three are really good for understanding exactly where the trajectory, the ideology, and how it's evolved over time.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you so much for these references, and thank you so much for talking to us about kind of, I don't want to see it as a big problem, because I remember last time, my grandpa was in Korea. And I know that the Korean War was a huge event for the PRC, for the Chinese people as well. Many on both sides died, and I just don't want to see any of that in the future. I think it would just be a freaking disaster all around for no reason, especially in an era where conflicts are not decisive or sharp. They just drag on forever, like in Ukraine. But before we sign off this transmission, do you have any parting thoughts?
The next 10 years are going to be extremely important to anyone listening to this. And I mean by that as right now we are going into an age of chaos where we're not sure what we stand for and not sure what we believe in. And these are the times when people start to figure out what that means. And if the earlier you can get started onto that, understanding why you do what you do, why you are in the country you live in, what do you stand for, the earlier you can get this, the more you can seize the next era. And that is a rule of history. If you look at any time and period in history, it's always the case where these extraordinary people who would have been just normal people in a prosperous time become extraordinary people when chaos emerges. And being able to think about those questions and act on that is going to be crucial in the next 10 years.
I think that's great. And I think the most interesting thing that Nietzsche talks about culture is that culture often is a reflection of deep pain, right? Pain deepens our understanding of the world, right? It deepens our meaning and our attachment to things, and we become more, let's say, locked on as far as the cultural implications, experiences that we have, and we make them into art, right? And, obviously, well, I'll be honest here. I'm a warrior. I think it's a good thing. I think it's important because I think America, especially the world, has become rich for too long, too decadent for too long. And I think what we need is a good freaking slap in the face and a wake-up call and a reality check. And I think it will be a moment where the West and I think the world is just like you say, will be afforded the opportunity to be men again. And I think this is the most important thing, that life goes on. And, Francis Fukuyama, I have a personal academic vendetta against him. Maybe it's even spiritual, because do you know what it's like to read freaking The End of History, The Last Man, when you're 13 and you're thinking the world's going to move on and it doesn't? And, because this guy's just demoralizing as hell. And luckily, the world does move on, and that Trotskyite is eating his words every year. But I guess to quote or paraphrase badly a Chinese proverb, it's "May we live in interesting times," huh?
Yeah, I also add Machiavelli in there too. Time drives forward all things good and evil, and you'll see me quote that quite often, because even in good times and bad times, there's opportunities. It's just you have to be able to look for them.
Well, thank you so much, Warrior. I really do appreciate you coming on. I know we're going to sit back, relax, and hit some of the clubs now, but, thank you for rendezvousing with me. And this is the War Room. This is the People's Art of War. I'm going to link him below. Signing off. Thank you.